I don't know if you guys were able to see, I was on the other side of the church, but I saw Sam today. Did you guys see? And he was rolling a baby buggy. So I assumed the new baby was, yes. So, word on the street. Just wanted to let you know. I see word on the street is, you guys know, next week I'm starting our new series. Is that why you all are going on vacation? We had a good week. Sundays this morning, Pastor Brent was just on Target today, and this story of is a very interesting story to just see Jesus' response. And it's very funny because you need to pause, because that's just not the response you were taught he gives. But every now and then, you know where you want a conversation to go. And he pushes on her, and she responds, well, obviously, with great faith. And so what an exciting passage to just ponder for just a second, think through. Last week we worked on the fear of the Lord. We grabbed our starting point from our studies in Exodus, and you remember some of those incidents in Exodus that prompted that response of fear and dread, and you see some people responding correctly. Distance, you remember last week we saw, or through Exodus, we saw a couple characters not respond correctly. Who is this Lord? And acting as if, there's no consequence here. So Ryan took us into Proverbs to talk about the fear of the Lord and how it begins to think. But fools despise wisdom. They despise instruction. Ryan is here for part 2. Ready to roll. Even Jess is here, which is more exciting. Equally exciting. And he's going to take us launching from Exodus into a New Testament study, and that's our topic for today, Ryan.
Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. So I enjoyed the study last week. I know there was, as I mentioned last week when I introduced it, studying the fear of the Lord, and then you come across the commentator who said this is the key point of the entire Old Testament. It's pretty weighty. But as we finished our series on Exodus, and that was the fear of the Lord should have impacted the everyday lives of the believers. Is the fear of the Lord. So just like in the Old Testament, several themes that we talked about in that last day that impacted us as we studied through, the New Testament authors saw a lot of the same things. They bring up these themes that come and are rooted in Exodus, and there's plenty of them we could have talked about and we brought up. For instance, in Hebrews, Jesus is the better Moses. What is the author doing there when he brings up and recalls Moses? Or perhaps Luke's refers to the Exodus, or Luke's the Exodus when he tells of the Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah are talking with each other about the Exodus, the Greek word exodos, that Jesus is about to bring about in Jerusalem. So perhaps he's making allusions there to the Exodus, the greater Exodus that Jesus will bring. Jesus is the Passover lamb. We talked about that in church a while ago in 1 Corinthians 5. In Hebrews, again, you didn't come to Mount Sinai, as Moses said, I had trembling with fear. The author of Hebrews says you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, a heavenly Jerusalem. And all these themes bring up, the authors are doing something different, but these themes, these ideas, what they're alluding to, are rooted in Exodus, the study that we just got done with. And these authors are bringing these about. And I say this because I want to stress how foundational Exodus is as the Old Testament showcase for God's covenantal love to his people. Now, I would have loved to take one of these passages and study them and bring them out, but I wanted to cite in you guys a study and understanding of how Exodus impacts the Old Testament, how Exodus impacts the New Testament. So as you go about in your study, think through these concepts. Who is the Lord? The fear of the Lord as it impacts the Old Testament. As the authors bring up, what are they referring to? But I want to look today at a particular passage that Paul makes an application from, you could say, our study in Exodus. He makes one particular application to a church in Corinth. So we'll open up your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So as we take a break in the main service through Corinthians, I guess we'll do a study today. And I did ask Pastor Brent if it was okay if I did Corinthians. This is a little bit of a difficult passage as we'll get into, but he was excited that someone will understand before he goes, before he gets there. So we'll talk about it. I'll make an application, but the rest of the understanding I'll let you wait for. He'll tell you what it really means, I guess. But no, I look forward to our study today. But Paul, as he thinks about the Exodus event, makes a particular application that we want to look at today. Let's begin our study. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I just want to read the first 4 verses. The way to start in the study. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. So you can hear these allusions back to the Exodus event. I mean, plenty of them. The cloud, the sea, Moses, this spiritual food, the spiritual drink from this rock. You remember Moses, the water came from the rock, and Paul says that rock was Christ. Now you can understand some of the difficulty there, and you read Exodus and you remember that account. Did you picture in your mind that that Moses was talking to Christ when he struck Christ? So there's some difficulties here as Paul brings out, but I think he's making a particular point, as we'll see in the larger passage. So we haven't gotten here in the service just yet, talking about the larger context. But chapter 10 falls in a larger section, starting in chapter 8. See, as Paul talks with writes back to Corinth, this is his third letter that he's written back and forth to him. Well, apparently somewhere along the lines, the Corinthian church wrote Paul a series of questions. If you look earlier in chapter 7, Paul starts it out saying, now concerning some of the matters of which you wrote to me. So apparently along the way, they had some questions. This is a new church, new believers, a lot of things going on they're not quite understanding. So they write Paul a series of questions, and some of these are responses. But the larger section that he starts one here is chapter 8. Now concerning food offered to idols. And he lists out several different principles, and then chapter 10, he goes into the history of Israel as a way of application. See, a particular concern for the Corinthians was this food offered to idols. These were the best cuts of meat. They were sold the day after. They were used, but they were sold the day after because they didn't want them to spoil, but they were really cheap. And it was the good meat. Some Christians were going and buying it and like, yeah, this is good. Idols are nothing. This food is nothing. But some Christians couldn't wrap their minds around how can you eat this meat? And they maybe were saved out of this temple worship, this idol worship. I can't eat this. This was offered to a false god. And so they ask him, Paul, what should we do? And it takes about 3 chapters to really unfold this. He doesn't quite answer the question because there's a bigger concern here at play. But in chapter 10, he said, consider the Israel people. So chapter 8, he walks through some of the issues of how to treat your brother. Chapter 9, he gives himself as an example. Look at me. I give up my liberties, so I become all to all people, so I can save some. And Paul could have stopped in chapter 9. He seems to make a pretty salient point in chapter 9 about treating your brother. The greatest concept is love in this whole issue. And I give up my liberties to save some. You guys can give up some. But he goes on from chapter 9 to make another point in chapter 10. And it's a warning looking at Israel, as we just read, looking at the Exodus event, these people as they came through. And so Paul sees a similarity of what's going on in the church at Corinth, these believers and their questions, to this Exodus event. He sees a correlation here, and he brings up, and even hinting that when he says our ancestors, maybe including the Corinthian church here as a way of saying these Old Testament saints, these other people of God in the Old Testament, we have these scriptures for us. But our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Now we remember this story. The pillar of smoke that led them, the pillar of fire by day, they passed through the sea. And I think he brings that up in verse 1 by a way of reminder, because he repeats those two words, the cloud and the sea, in verse 2. So verse 2 is kind of the point he gets to. So you remember this event. They passed the cloud and the sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. Now, when we studied Exodus, I don't believe we ever talked about being baptized as they crossed the Red Sea. Or even when the cloud led them, or even cloud covering the tabernacle, we didn't describe it in terms of baptism. It's kind of an odd way of Paul accounting this event. Baptism in the sea, okay, maybe they went under the water and they came out and risen to walk in newness of life on the other side of the Red Sea. We didn't talk about baptism there. Surely it was miraculous. But I'm not even sure we even mentioned how that event was baptism into Moses. What relationship did Moses have in it? I don't think we would call it a union with Moses, but Paul seems to say it's kind of weird language, it seems. And I don't think I came across, and maybe Dr. Hassler, you can help me out. I don't know if I came across an Old Testament theology that talks about union with Moses as much as we would say Christ did when we talk about union with Christ. So Paul here somehow sees a correlation between the Corinthian church and Israel and baptizing into Moses, baptizing through the cloud and the sea. And even verse 3, they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. I've got to ask, in what way are we to understand spiritual? Sometimes when we hear spiritual, we think we contrast it with physical. That, I'm a spiritual person, something almost abstract, metaphysical, not real, but even in studying Exodus, we know what that spiritual food was. It said it was manna. So okay, maybe it came from heaven. Maybe that's what Paul's saying, that this food that came from heaven. But you also have the quail. And Exodus says how the quail came about. The Lord brought up a wind and brought the quail around. But even that is wrapped up in spiritual food. And the spiritual drink, as we know, that water that flowed, that Moses was supposed to strike the rock or speak to the rock, and this water came. But Paul describes it as spiritual. And it seems to say that the spiritual is the source. The source of where this food came from, the source of the water, is divinely given. So Israel had a unique position for 40 years that God was divinely giving them food and drink in the wilderness. So they had the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. It's interesting, he talks about the same spiritual drink. Is that all Israel drank the same thing, or Corinthians drink the same spiritual drink and food that they have? It's interesting, some of this relation, not quite understanding where Paul's going, how he's making this application. Especially when you're talking about this drink from the rock, Paul goes further and said they drank from that spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Literally in Greek, some translations bring that out, the rock that was rolling with them, the rolling rock. And there's some rabbinic traditions too that literally have that in mind, as Israel was traveling and wandering, zigzagging through the wilderness. So this rock was behind them, rolling along with them. Some rabbinic traditions too that the rock looked like a well, and it was rolling with them and stopped. So is Paul bringing up this old rabbinic tradition that this rock literally followed them? But even then, how was that rock Christ? And what was that relationship there? Some rabbinic traditions see this as a pre-incarnate wisdom of God. Last week we briefly looked at Proverbs. In Proverbs 1 through 9, Wisdom is personified as a person, a lady of wisdom. She said, I was there in the beginning. I was there with Yahweh. I was there when everything was created. By me, things were created. And so the old Jewish rabbinic scholars say maybe this was the wisdom that flowed with God, that accompanied him, that provided and nourished him through the wilderness. In some way, you know, say they're kind of confused. They're not quite sure what was going on here. Was that rock? Was there two different rocks? Like I said, Pastor Brent will fill you in on that one when he comes. But it does seem to say that there was a rock at the beginning, there was a rock at the end. Some scholars wonder whether or not Paul is bringing up an allegory. Is this an illustration? But again, when we studied Exodus, did you guys imagine Moses talking to Jesus? And water flowed, this living water that you talked about flowed back then when Moses struck Jesus. That's not the image we got. Was this an allegory, a metaphor, or is this a type? You know, we use these words to talk about the relationship of the Old Testament and New Testament. That's huge. You know, as the Hebrew author says that Jesus is the better Moses, is Paul saying that Jesus is the better rock that accompanies us in our wilderness wanderings? I mean, it seems unlikely. Most scholars do go back to the rock being a name for God, a title for God. He is my rock and salvation kind of language. But I think, too, there's a more firm way of understanding this. Who talked to Moses in the burning bush? Do you guys remember? Who spoke to Moses in the burning bush when he was intrigued? Bush wasn't burning. Who spoke? Does Moses recall who spoke to him from the burning bush?
The angel of the Lord.
Well, I heard two answers, God and the angel of the Lord, and yes, you're right. So the angel of the Lord, but it goes back and forth. The angel of the Lord spoke and said, take off your shoes for this holy ground. Only God says that. And in the Exodus event, there's Exodus 14, 23, 32, 33. And the angel of the Lord keeps coming up over and over again. To where God is telling Moses, I'm going to send this angel of the Lord before you. Obey his voice in all that I tell you. Well, even God himself is elevating this angel of the Lord to authority, divine status. And I think Paul's here making allusion to a Christian experience, but you know, Exodus 17:6, the angel of the Lord says, I will go before you, and I will stand on that rock. As you strike it, it will give you waters. And I think there's a relationship there with that rock, that the angel of the Lord did stand on that rock. He was there, but he was present with Israel from the beginning of the burning bush, with them through the pillar of smoke and fire, through them with the sea, and through the wilderness wanderings, bringing them into the land. And Paul brings up that, okay, there's that relationship there that even Israel enjoyed this blessing, this relationship with Christ. And he's making an analogy here. I think some scholars take way too far to say that rock was literally Christ, or that, yeah, the angel of the Lord was present there. But he's making an analogy a lot to the Christian experience. So we even recalled baptism into Moses, baptism in the Red Sea, into the cloud. It's kind of awkward language to talk about after studying Exodus. We didn't think of it in terms of baptism. And I think Paul is bringing this to their attention and say there is a relationship here, in a manner of speaking. Because notice the emphasis on all. In these 4 verses, we have 5 times that Paul says all. Notice that our answer says all were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. And sometimes translated, verse 4, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. Israel had an unparalleled experience of God's blessing more than any other nation in history. They had this God redeem them, bring them through this land, you bring them to this land, but yet verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And he starts to bring up this point to this church that there's start to bring this warning that Israel had all these blessings they enjoyed. So imagine baptism, what we think of baptism. Yeah, there's a lot that entails, and the pastors work through with a new believer before they're baptized of, do you understand who the Lord is? Do you understand what He has done? He has redeemed you, brought you to a new life. He's baptized you. Now you participate what it seems to be saying the Lord's Supper. And he'll make that point in verse 15 a little bit later. You participate in the cup of blessing, which is the blood of Christ. The bread, participate with the body of Christ. Unbelievers can't take part in the Lord's Supper. That's a blessing for a Christian. Unbelievers aren't redeemed. That's a blessing for the Christian. Just like Israel was taken, they were in slavery, brought out, redeemed, had this fellowship with God. They had all these, existentially, had all these blessings on them, yet, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And that's Paul's point as he's going through. The Corinthians are asking this larger question, food offered to idols. And Paul works in there. There's principles here to understand. There's disputable matters, how to consider somebody else. But understand in Israel's history, they too had an unparalleled blessing of God, like a believer, more than any other nation, more than any other Gentile this church is experiencing. You have these blessings, yet they failed and died. Don't set your heart on evil things as they did. And he'll give 4 different examples. Verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, verse 10. And I think this verse is the main, you can call it heading of them all. Don't set your hearts on evil things as they did. So it goes through these examples, and each time, don't be this as they did, because this happened. And it's usually they died. Don't do this because they did and they died. Don't do this, they did and they died. But it comes back to, they have these blessings of God, but yet they set their heart on evil things. So you can imagine, and we've heard this as we studied too, that they get out a couple of days from this event, the Exodus, and they're leaving Egypt, and they're already complaining and grumbling. Yeah, that eagle's wings was 3 hard days of no water, no food. But remember what they're saying. Having been redeemed from Egypt, they're thinking and grumbling, man, wasn't it nice back in Egypt? I had food, I had water. Sure, I had to work all day as a slave, but I ate. They had all kinds of different fish. Wasn't that fish good? And all we have is manna. It always tastes like honey every day. Now, what is this? You can imagine is that relationship back to the Corinthian church, that having been redeemed and now enjoy a blessing with God, they're thinking in their mind, wasn't it nice before I got saved? I had all kinds of freedom, let alone sleeping in on Sunday. But all these freedoms from the meat offered to idols, I don't have to worry about anybody else, no concern for my brother. Wasn't it nice back before I got saved? Paul gives these examples. This comes back to don't set your heart on evil things. And so, we could fly through these quickly, but, they're specific examples, but they're really general categories that some of them have talked about already in church through our study of 1 Corinthians. Verse 7, don't be idolaters. Some of them were, as is written, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. So in Exodus 32, this is a direct quote from Exodus 32. They don't know what happened to Moses. He's been gone. And so they give Aaron all the gold, throws in the fire, and out comes a golden calf, and here's your God. Sure, mountain, but this is him, but we're going to worship him. But they were drinking, indulging in, as Paul says, revelry. Utter sin. Having been redeemed, they were idolaters. Verse 8, should not commit sexual immorality. I'm sure last week was a pretty tough passage for Pastor Brent to say that in front of all these people, talking about what he talked about. Not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day, 23,000 of them fell. In one day. And some of these, too, have larger connections to Corinthian church, the food offered to idols. Because even in this may be a reference to Numbers 25. A lot of Israel's said, whored after the daughters of Moab. But these daughters were also taking their hearts away from Yahweh and to worship Baal. Sometimes we get in our mind, too, that the Hebrew slaves worked every day praying that God would redeem them. And that they worshipped only God and they were waiting on this promise of Abraham. But Deuteronomy says they were worshiping other gods while still in Egypt. And God didn't only redeem them from their slavery, but also redeem them from other gods. And so when he says, my name is I am your God, you shall have no other gods before me, that's pretty foundational for the Hebrews because they had other gods. They worshipped other gods. And now they see they're being redeemed by Yahweh Elohim, and he is my God. But you see, on the other side of the river, or other side of the sea, we should not commit sexual immorality as they did because they went and whored after other gods and became idolaters. He seems to be two of the bigger issues, but he kind of goes to generic categories. I mean, we should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. Again, we answered the Lord or angel of the Lord. Yeah, you're right. I think this is one of those times, too, where they put the Lord to the test. Paul says Christ. Some of them did, and they were killed by snakes. And Numbers 21, they were complaining about this food, this miserable, worthless food, coming from heaven every day. Can you believe it? It's worthless. And they were grumbling. They didn't want anymore. God sent snakes and bit them. So we should not put Christ to the test, as they did. I'm trying to think of which way Paul is saying how we would put Christ to the test. I think coming back to enjoying a blessing of God through having redeemed us and all these blessings that we have now as Christians, assuming that we're okay. That we don't have to worry about sin. We don't have to worry about these other things. We don't have to worry about our, Corinthians specific, our liberties and concerning for other people. But just assuming that God's faithfulness, He'll bring me through. Sometimes we talk about the temptation of sin and we're tricked into thinking, God will forgive. He's faithful, right? He'll forgive me. Don't put Christ to the test as they did. Do not grumble as they did and destroyed by the angel. Again, kind of vague, could be reference to one of the plagues in 16 has some of the similar languages, but how often do we see them grumble through, even in Exodus, but going all the way through Numbers and then to Deuteronomy? Paul, or Moses again, is saying, don't be like your fathers. Don't grumble as they did. Now these are different examples, but Paul comes back to his point that he began with, that these things happen to them as examples and written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages have come. Now, there seems to be a lot packed in that statement, the culmination of the ages have come, but similar language to these latter days, we would say the church age, so these last days, essentially. Culmination of the ages. So as Israel, through their history, and Christ came, redeemed the church, brought them through missionary expansion. Now in Corinth, these times and changes are all coming together, and they're believers now in Corinth. So the culmination of the ages, in a sense, the church age, but these things happen and were written down as a warning for us. So they're concerned about whether or not meat offered to idols. And yeah, there's these principles there, but do understand there is a history of people who went after other gods and other idols through a different means. Yeah, food offered to idols, sexual immorality. And we really hit on that last week, 1 Corinthians 6. But don't set your heart on evil things as they did. And in verse 12, he comes back to that same point. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. It's easy to look at Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these people, even in Joshua, it seems to have some victory again, but again, Judges, they forgot the Lord. There was evil in the sight. Like, how could you do this? It's easy to think that way, but if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Yeah, we have tremendous blessings in God, and it's kind of almost a leading question to say, do you think you're standing firm in God and your blessings with Him? Well, you'd almost want to say, yeah, I'm standing firm, but there's that part too. Be careful that you don't ride on that so much that you ignore all else. You ignore these warnings. You ignore what was written down in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, through the history of this church to warn you that you don't fall. Yeah, all these themes I mentioned earlier, they're great. The new Exodus, this heavenly city, Mount Zion, all these beautiful images coming out, but Paul makes a pretty quick application right here, a moral application. Do not fall. Take it from them. They had these blessings. They ignored them, went after other gods, and they fell. And it's interesting that it seems to be that Paul could have ended this argument, this section here. Look at Israel. Don't do as they did. They died. You don't do that. But he goes on in verse 13, and it's probably a verse that we have memorized since we were a kid, but put some context in here that Paul says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. That's what he uses to launch his next point, but this application that Paul further goes on is rested in still the character and nature of God, the very character that we also saw in Exodus. Why did God say that He redeemed Israel out of Egypt? Is it because they were a great nation, they were a large number, they were mighty men, they were strong, they could, accomplish something for God? No, I was faithful. I made a promise. And I was faithful to that promise, and I redeemed you. So, verse 13 doesn't really seem to fit the argument necessarily in Corinthians, the point that he's making. He seems to take a step back, and based on a character and nature of God, he makes a general application to all believers, seemingly Old Testament too, but even now, that there is no temptation that has overtaken you, that you've ever fell into or has ever come at you, that is not unique to you. Put a reverse in there. It's common to mankind. People have gone through other similar struggles. Yeah, the situation now in the 21st century may be unique. Moses probably didn't struggle with distraction on his iPhone as much as we do, but there is certain, lay down, rose up to play kind of language, maybe that's going on. But these situations aren't unique. But it's rested in, too, that God is faithful. And even in these temptations, He will not let you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Now, in the larger context of Him answering whether or not you can eat idols, or eat food offered to idols in Corinth, telling them that God will give you a way of escape, there's no temptation. I mean, it's kind of there, but he takes a step back, really say, God is faithful, and to His believers, to His people, there is no temptation that can overtake you. There's no temptation that is too much for you to bear. In the wilderness wanderings, even now, but even when you're tempted, He will also provide a way out so you can endure it. So Paul's big category say, don't set your heart on evil things as they did. And even though your heart set on God, is set on the fear of the Lord, taking these warnings, you will be tempted. Know that it's not unique to you. But even in that moment, He'll provide a way of an escape. He doesn't say how, it doesn't say what. Maybe it fits or matches the temptation, but maybe it's a passage that we memorized back when I was in Awana. Growing up in youth group, like, okay, memorize this verse, got whatever badge it was, it's been so long I don't remember, but this verse popped in my mind so many times that in that moment of a temptation, you say, God's going to give me a way of escape. And you start noticing, this is my moment. And in that moment, that critical moment of whether or not you are choosing to sin or to enjoy the blessings of God, realize what you were saying. You're testing Christ, so to speak, but you are telling God that what you're about to do is better than any blessing He's going to give you. And in that moment, what do you think that the Israelites did when they went to that moment? What these other nations have is better than the Lord's blessings, and some of them fell. Don't be so arrogant to think that you are a Christian, that you can tell God that His blessings aren't worth what you're about to do. In any temptation, He will give you that way of an escape. But I think temptations is neutral enough sort of word that it doesn't necessarily describe a temptation to sin. Typically when we talk about temptation, it is temptation to sin. Satan tempting Jesus to sin. But a while back ago we did study the book of James, and this word tempting, testing, even the wilderness wanderings as they were going through, it was a hard time. The Lord said, I did this to test you as well, that this testing may not be a moral sin, whether or not you're struggling with addiction or whatever it would be, but as a trial, as a test of your faith. Make an application today. Maybe this is the hardest Mother's Day you've gone through. For whatever reason in family history, you said I lost your mom, whatever happened, and this is one of the hardest Mother's Day you've gone through, since it's a testing. Where's your faithfulness at? The wilderness wanderings, whatever trial that is about to come or is on you, there is a way, and God will provide means to endure it. It doesn't say what these means are. Are they other people? Is it a realization that this is the moment to escape and, like Joseph, just leave my coat, run out, and flee? Verse 14, flee idolatry. Is it that kind of word, that moment? Yeah, it could be. Is it a struggle or a trial that you're going through in your life that the gift that God gives for you to endure it is somebody else in this class? Yeah. Yeah, it could be. But these things are rested in the character of God, that God is faithful. And just as Israel, as we just studied in Exodus, had these blessings, unlike any other nation, to share in a blessing of God, this same God is faithful. He said, don't be as some of them were, and set your heart on evil things. So again, as we leave this series, we begin the next series, whatever it may be, as you're reading through the Bible, think of these themes of the Exodus, of how it impacts other studies, but even the New Testament too, seeing these people, but as an example for us to set our heart and our minds on the Lord. Is the great Deuteronomy 6. Love your Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and your mind. Set your mind on Him, for this God is faithful. There's a lot implications, Old Testament, New Testament, all these difficulties, but Paul gets to the main point here. And so if you have any questions, Pastor Brent will love to answer you in a couple months from now when he hits chapter 10. But I pray that you guys enjoy your Mother's Day, enjoy your time with family, but also think too through the people of God who went through their testing and trials, that we are thankful that we have these written down for us. So let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord, you are awesome to think through Exodus and the events there as they saw you on the mountain, that this is and truly awesome, God. As we grow in our understanding of you and your commitment to your people, your faithfulness, but also your jealousy, your righteous anger towards sin. And Lord, you hated sin so much, you took it out on your Son. And what a blessing that we share today, and that we unite here together today under that banner of born again, redeemed, bought by the precious blood of the Lamb. Lord, I pray that we reflect on these things, that we enjoy you through all this and the gift of family and the gift of mothers we have today, but may we rest in you. You are faithful to bring us through. Lord, we love you and praise you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.